In Virginia, 1834, the world outside the Sullivan estate is hushed. The only sound, the restless wind threading through the ancient oaks. But within those brick walls, something else stirs, a secret so heavy it seems to press against the very stones, making them whisper in the darkness. Lanterns bob through the mist as a handful of men, faces drawn and pale, approach the grand house with trembling resolve. They are not here for justice, not yet. They are here because the rumors have grown too loud to ignore, because the missing children's names have become a litany in every prayer, every whispered conversation behind closed doors. The front door groans open, and the men step inside, boots echoing on polished wood. The air is thick with the scent of candle wax and something sour, something wrong. Down the hall, a narrow door leads to the basement, a place spoken of only in hushed tones, if at all. The men hesitate, exchanging glances, each silently hoping someone else will take the lead. But the silence is broken by a sound that chills the blood. The faint, metallic rattle of chains, rising from below. They descend, lanterns trembling in their hands, shadows leaping across the stone walls. The deeper they go, the colder it becomes, as if the house itself is recoiling from what lies beneath. At the bottom, the light falls upon a sight that will haunt them forever. Rows of children, eyes wide and hollow, limbs shackled to the walls. Some are silent, others whimper. All are gaunt and ghostly pale. The truth is more monstrous than any rumor. What really happened in the Sullivan basement? Why did no one speak out? Tonight, we begin to peel back the layers of silence, to listen to the walls that have whispered for far too long. Virginia, 1834. Virginia, 1834. A land suspended between the old world and the new, where the air is thick with the scent of magnolia and tobacco, and the sun sets in a blaze of gold over rolling fields. The genteel society of the South prides itself on its manners, its rituals, its unwavering sense of order. Here, every morning begins with the tolling of church bells and the rustle of silk dresses along gravel paths. The men tip their hats, the women exchange pleasantries, and the children those who are seen play beneath the watchful eyes of their elders. It is a world that seems, at first glance, to be built on civility and grace. But beneath the surface, the soil is restless. The plantations, with their grand facades and sprawling verandas, are monuments to both ambition and exploitation. The wealth of the few is built on the backs of the many, and the shadows cast by the great houses are long and deep. Whispers travel faster than the wind, rumors of disappearances, of children gone missing, of secrets buried in shelves lined with leather-bound books. The air is cool and still, heavy with the scent of lavender and old wood. Yet, there is a chill that lingers, a sense that the house is holding its breath. The laughter that echoes through the halls during parties fades quickly, leaving behind a silence that is almost accusatory. The Sullivans themselves are gracious hosts, but their smiles never quite reach their eyes. In the town below, life goes on. The market bustles with activity. The church is filled each Sunday, and the children, those who remain, are called home before dusk. But the stories persist, growing in the telling. Some say the Sullivans are cursed, others that they are simply unlucky. A few, braver souls, whisper of things seen at the edge of the woods, of cries carried on the night wind, of shadows moving behind the curtains when the moon is high. This is Virginia in 1834, a place of beauty and rot, of civility and cruelty, where the line between respectability and horror is as thin as the mist that rises from the fields at dawn. It is a world that invites you in with one hand, even as it hides the truth with the other. Tonight, you are not just a witness to history. You are a guest in a house where every wall has a story, and every shadow hides a secret. Will you dare to look closer? Pillars and pariahs. The Sullivan name was spoken with reverence in the drawing rooms of Virginia. 1834. Their lineage stretched back to the earliest days of the colony. Their ancestors having arrived with little more than a dream and a determination to carve their mark into the wild, untamed land. Over generations, the Sullivans amassed wealth and influence. their fortunes rising with the tobacco harvests and the expansion of their estate. By the time the events of that fateful year unfolded, the family had become both the pride and the enigma of the county. At the head of the household stood Charles Sullivan, a man whose presence filled any room he entered, tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of silver hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. Charles was a figure both admired and feared. He was known for his sharp intellect and his even sharper tongue, a man who could quote scripture as easily as he could recite the law. In public, he was the very model of Southern gentility, generous to the church, a patron of the local school, and a frequent host of lavish gatherings that drew guests from miles around. Yet, those who looked closer saw a man haunted by something unspoken, a restlessness that no amount of wealth or status could soothe. Beside him was his wife, Eleanor, a woman of delicate beauty and steely resolve. Eleanor was the heart of the household, orchestrating every detail of their social life with a grace that belied her iron will. She was admired for her charitable works, her skill at the piano, and her unwavering composure. But there were whispers, too, of her frequent absences, her long walks alone in the gardens at dusk, her tendency to stare out the window for hours, lost in thought. Some said she was mourning a child lost in infancy. Others claimed she was simply too refined for the rough realities of plantation life. Their children, 3 in number, were the subject of endless fascination and speculation. The eldest, Henry, was a young man of 20, recently returned from his studies in Richmond. Handsome and charming, he was the heir apparent, expected to carry on the family legacy. Yet, there was a wildness in him, a recklessness that surfaced in whispered stories of late-night escapades and heated arguments with his father. The middle child, Margaret, was 17, a beauty in her own right, but with a sharp wit that unsettled the local suitors. She was often seen reading in the library or riding alone through the woods, her independence both admired and frowned upon. The youngest, Thomas, was a sickly boy of 12, rarely seen in public, and often confined to his room. His pale face and wide, anxious eyes became the subject of cruel gossip. Some said he was cursed, others that he was simply too fragile for this world. The Sullivans' public life was a carefully choreographed performance, each member playing their part to perfection. Their home was a stage, their guests an audience, and every gesture was calculated to reinforce their status as pillars of the community. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Servants spoke in hushed tones of arguments behind closed doors, of strange visitors arriving at odd hours, of rooms that were always kept locked. There were rumors of debts, of business dealings gone awry, of a darkness that clung to the family like a shadow. Some said the Sullivans were cursed, that their good fortune had been bought at too high a price. Others believed they were simply victims of jealousy, their every misstep magnified by those who resented their success. But there were stories, too, that could not be so easily dismissed, stories of children who vanished near the estate, of cries heard in the night, of a coldness that seemed to seep from the very walls of the house. And yet, for all the suspicion, there was empathy as well. The Sullivans had suffered loss as children, buried in the family plot, a fire that had nearly destroyed the West Wing, a series of illnesses that left Eleanor frail and withdrawn. They were, in many ways, as vulnerable as they were powerful. Their lives shaped by the same forces of fate and misfortune that haunted every family in the region. To the outside world, the Sullivans were both pillars and pariahs, mired, envied, feared, and pitied in equal measure. Their story was a tapestry woven from threads of ambition and tragedy, love and betrayal, secrets and lies, and as the events of 1834 would soon reveal, the line between respectability and ruin was far thinner than anyone dared to imagine. Disappearances and denial, it began, as these things so often do, with a single missing child. Her name was Leila May Carter, a girl of 7 with a gap-toothed smile and a fondness for wildflowers. One afternoon, she vanished from the edge of her family's field, her basket of violets left trampled in the grass. Her mother's cries echoed through the valley. And for a brief, fevered moment, the entire community turned out to search, combing the woods, calling her name, lighting lanterns against the encroaching dusk. But as the days passed and hope faded, the searchers drifted home, their voices growing quieter, their eyes averted from the Carter family's grief. Lila May was not the first to disappear, though she was the first whose absence could not be explained away. Before her, there had been other children who slipped from their beds in the night, boys who failed to return from fishing trips, girls who vanished on their way to the market. Each time, the explanations were as swift as they were unsatisfying. A runaway, a wild animal, a tragic accident. The community, bound by its own unspoken rules, preferred the comfort of denial to the terror of the unknown. Hushed conversations flickered like candle flames in the dark. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers checked the locks on their doors. But no one dared to speak openly of what they feared. The church sermons grew more urgent, the prayers more desperate, but the names of the missing were rarely uttered from the pulpit. Instead, there was a collective turning away, a refusal to look too closely, to ask the questions that might shatter the fragile peace. The Sullivans, for their part, seemed untouched by the growing unease. Their parties continued, their laughter ringing out across the fields, their carriages rolling through town as if nothing had changed. Charles Sullivan offered generous donations to the search efforts, his voice grave with sympathy, but his eyes remained distant, unreadable. Eleanor sent baskets of food to grieving families, her notes filled with platitudes and prayers. Yet, behind closed doors, the servants whispered of strange noises in the night, of children's voices echoing from the basement, of locks and keys and doors that should never be opened. Rumors began to coil through the town, like smoke. Some said the Sullivans were cursed, that their house was built on land that had never been properly blessed. Others whispered of secret societies, of rituals performed in the dead of night, of debts owed to forces best left unnamed. A few braver souls wondered aloud if the family's wealth had been bought with more than just hard work and good fortune. But these whispers were quickly silenced, drowned out by the louder voices of those who insisted that such things could never happen here. The local authorities, too, seemed reluctant to act. The sheriff, a man more comfortable with paperwork than confrontation, dismissed the disappearances as the unfortunate realities of rural life. Children wander off, he would say, his tone weary. It's a dangerous world out there. When pressed, he would point to the lack of evidence, the absence of witnesses, the impossibility of accusing a family as prominent as the Sullivans without proof. And so, the files grew thicker, the names longer, but the answers remained elusive. There were moments, though, when the truth threatened to break through. A farmer's wife claimed to have seen a pale face at the window of the Sullivan basement, eyes wide with terror. A group of boys, daring each other to approach the estate at night, swore they heard crying from beneath the ground. Each time, the stories were dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations, the fevered dreams of a community on edge. But the fear lingered, growing heavier with each passing day. Why did no one investigate sooner? Was it fear of the Sullivans' power, or simply the human instinct to look away from what we cannot bear to face? Was it easier to believe in wild animals and accidents than to confront the possibility of evil in their midst? Or was it something deeper, collective guilt, a sense that by ignoring the darkness, they could somehow keep it at bay? I want to ask you, the listener, have you ever sensed something was wrong in your own community? Have you ever felt the weight of secrets pressing down, the urge to look away rather than confront the truth? If so, share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, even when others choose silence. As the months passed, the disappearances became a grim litany, each new name a fresh wound in the fabric of the town. The children's faces stared out from hastily drawn sketches, their eyes pleading for answers that would never come. And still, the Sullivans' house stood silent and imposing on the hill, its windows dark, its secrets locked away. The whispers grew louder, the fear more palpable, but the truth remained just out of reach, waiting, patient, in the shadows. The night the truth finally clawed its way into the open was one of those rare Virginia evenings when the air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. A storm had rolled in from the west, thunder muttering in the distance, lightning flickering behind the clouds like the pulse of some great unseen heart. The Sullivan estate, usually so serene, was a silhouette of menace against the bruised sky, its windows dark, its gardens shrouded in restless shadows. It was just past midnight when the sheriff and his hastily assembled posse arrived at the gates. Their faces were drawn, their eyes darting nervously as they exchanged whispered prayers and half-hearted reassurances. Each man carried a lantern, the flames guttering in the wind, casting wild, shifting shapes across the gravel drive. The iron gates, so often a symbol of the Sullivans' unassailable status, creaked open with a reluctant groan, as if the house itself was protesting the intrusion. Inside, the air was thick and close, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something far less pleasant, an undercurrent of rot, of old fear and older secrets. The grand foyer, with its polished floors and gleaming chandeliers, seemed to mock the men's unease, every surface reflecting their pale, anxious faces. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour, each note echoing through the empty halls like a warning. They moved as one, boots thudding on the floorboards, the light from their lanterns trembling as they passed through the house. The servants had vanished, the Sullivans themselves nowhere to be seen. Only the silence remained, thick and suffocating, broken now and then by the distant rumble of thunder. It was Henry Sullivan, the eldest son, who had finally confessed, his voice shaking, his eyes hollow with guilt. He had led them to the door at the end of the corridor, a door that had always been kept locked, its key hidden away. The sheriff hesitated, his hand trembling as he fitted the key into the lock. The door swung open with a reluctant sigh, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. The men exchanged glances, each silently willing another to go first. In the end, it was the youngest deputy who led the way, his lantern held high, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The descent was slow, each step creaking beneath their weight. The air grew colder, the smell of mildew and decay growing stronger with every footfall. The walls, slick with condensation, seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing at their backs. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a low, vaulted chamber, the ceiling lost in shadow. And there, in the flickering light, they saw them. Rows of children, chained to the walls by iron manacles, their faces pale and hollow-eyed, their bodies gaunt and bruised. Some were huddled together for warmth, others sat alone, staring blankly into the darkness. The youngest could not have been more than 4 or 5, their small wrists swallowed by the heavy shackles. The older ones looked up as the lanterns approached, their eyes wide with terror and hope in equal measure. The rescuers froze, the horror of the scene rooting them to the spot. One man dropped his lantern, the glass shattering on the stone floor, the flames sputtering out. Another fell to his knees, retching, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his rosary. The sheriff, his face ashen, whispered a prayer under his breath, his voice barely audible above the sound of the children's ragged breathing. The contrast was stark innocence and corruption laid bare in the cold, unyielding light. The children, robbed of their childhoods, their trust, their very names, looked up at the men with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The adults, so long complicit in their silence, now faced the consequences of their denial. The weight of guilt pressed down on them, heavier than any chain. The days that followed the discovery in the Sullivan basement were a fever dream of chaos and revelation. Word spread like wildfire, igniting every corner of the county with outrage, disbelief, and a gnawing sense of shame. The Sullivans' estate, once a symbol of untouchable prestige, became a fortress besieged by questions. The authorities, so long content to look the other way, now found themselves at the center of a storm they could neither control nor contain. The investigation began with the children. Doctors and midwives from neighboring towns were summoned to tend to their wounds, both visible and invisible. The youngest clung to their rescuers, unable to speak, while the older ones recounted their ordeal in halting, broken voices. Each story was a thread, and as the investigators pulled, the tapestry of complicity began to unravel. The servants were the first to be questioned. For years, they had moved like shadows through the Sullivan house, their presence barely acknowledged by their employers. Now, under the harsh glare of suspicion, their stories spilled out fragments of truth, half-remembered conversations, glimpses of horror glimpsed through keyholes and cracks in the floorboards. Some claimed ignorance, insisting they had never set foot in the basement, that they had only ever followed orders. Others wept as they confessed to hearing cries in the night, to seeing bruises on the children who were brought in under cover of darkness. A few, braver than the rest, admitted to trying to help smuggling scraps of food, whispering words of comfort, praying for deliverance that never came. But the web stretched further still. Neighbors, who had long envied the Sullivans' wealth and resented their aloofness, now found themselves under scrutiny. Why had they not spoken up when they saw children wandering the woods near the estate, their clothes torn and their eyes wild with fear? Why had they dismissed the stories of missing children as mere gossip, or worse, as the result of poor parenting? Some insisted they had tried to raise the alarm, only to be silenced by the weight of the Sullivans' influence. Others admitted, with downcast eyes, that they had simply not wanted to get involved. The officials, too, were not immune. The sheriff, once so quick to dismiss the disappearances, now faced the wrath of a community betrayed. His deputies, some of whom had attended the Sullivans' parties and accepted their hospitality, struggled to reconcile their memories of laughter and music with the horrors they had uncovered. The magistrate, a man known for his strict adherence to the law, found himself questioning the very foundations of justice. Had they all been blinded by the Sullivans' charm, or had they chosen blindness as a shield against the darkness? As the investigation deepened, the lines between faith and superstition, law and justice, grew ever more blurred. The local pastor, a man of unshakable conviction, thundered from the pulpit about sin and redemption, urging his flock to seek forgiveness for their Yet, in the quiet corners of the town, old women whispered of curses and restless spirits, of the land itself crying out for vengeance. Some believed the Sullivans had been punished by forces beyond mortal understanding, that the evil in their house was a contagion that had spread through the very soil. Others clung to the hope that justice, however delayed, would finally prevail. The psychological horror of denial and rationalization seeped into every conversation. Parents reassured themselves that their own children were safe, that such things could never happen to them. Friends and neighbors exchanged nervous glances, each wondering what secrets the other might be hiding. The Sullivans' former allies distanced themselves, rewriting history in real time, insisting they had always suspected something was amiss, that they had done all they could. But the truth was more complicated, more damning. The community had been complicit, not through malice, but through the slow, corrosive power of indifference. The investigators, for their part, struggled to piece together a coherent narrative from the fragments of testimony and evidence. The children's accounts were inconsistent, clouded by trauma and fear. The servants' stories contradicted one another, each colored by self-preservation and guilt. The Sullivans themselves were a study in contrasts, Charles silent and unyielding, Eleanor weeping and incoherent, Henry racked with remorse, Margaret defiant, Thomas withdrawn into a silence so deep it seemed unbreakable. The law demanded answers, demanded punishment. But justice, in this place and time, was a slippery thing. The Sullivans' wealth and connections shielded them from the full force of retribution. Even as the townsfolk clamored for blood, some called for a public trial, others for swift, private vengeance. The children, now wards of the state, became symbols of both innocence lost and the community's failure. Their faces haunted the dreams of those who had once looked away. Faith and superstition warred in the hearts of the people. Some sought solace in prayer, others in old rituals meant to ward off evil. The church was filled to overflowing, the air thick with incense and whispered confessions. Yet, outside its walls, the old stories persisted of haunted houses, of restless spirits, of sins that could never be washed away. Who was truly to blame? Was it the Sullivans, whose cruelty had been hidden behind a mask of respectability? The servants, who had seen but not spoken? The neighbors, who had heard but not listened? The officials, who had chosen comfort over confrontation? Or was it all of them, bound together by a web of silence and fear? I want to hear your thoughts. Who do you believe bears the greatest guilt? Was it cowardice, complicity, or something darker that allowed this horror to fester for so long? Share your perspective in the comments below. Your voice is part of this story now. As the investigation dragged on, the community was left to grapple with the enormity of what had been uncovered. The Sullivans' house stood empty, its windows boarded up, its gardens overgrown. The children, scattered to orphanages and distant relatives, carried their scars with them, silent reminders of a nightmare that could not be forgotten. The town itself was changed, its innocence lost, its certainties shattered. Yet, even as the official inquiry drew to a close, there remained questions that no one could answer. What had truly happened in the Sullivan basement? How many others had known and chosen to remain silent? And what, if anything, could be done to ensure that such evil would never take root again? The web had been unraveled, but the wounds it left behind would take far longer to heal. And in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the trees and the shadows lengthened across the fields, the people of the county could not help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. The truth, when it finally emerged, was not a single, blinding flash, but a slow, excruciating, unspooling tapestry of motives, madness, and monstrous rationalizations that defied easy explanation. The Sullivans, once the county's golden family, were now exposed as architects of a horror so profound that even the most jaded investigators struggled to comprehend it. Charles Sullivan, the patriarch, was the first to break his silence. In the dim, echoing chamber of the county jail, he spoke with a calmness that chilled the blood. He described his actions not as crimes, but as necessities, sacrifices demanded by a world he believed was teetering on the edge of chaos. He spoke of visions, of dreams that came to him in the dead of night, whispering of a coming darkness that only he could hold at bay. The children, he claimed, were chosen not by him, but by fate, by forces older and more powerful than any earthly law. He insisted that their suffering was a shield, a bulwark against some nameless evil that threatened to consume them all. Eleanor's confession was different, fragmented, feverish, laced with grief and guilt. She wept for the children, for her own lost innocence, for the life she had once imagined. She spoke of her husband's obsessions, of the rituals he performed in the basement, of the strange symbols carved into the stone. She admitted to knowing, to suspecting, but insisted she had been powerless to stop him. Her love for her children warred with her terror of a husband. And in the end, she had chosen silence over confrontation, a choice that haunted her every waking moment. Henry, the eldest son, was consumed by remorse. He described a childhood spent in the shadow of his father's madness, of being groomed to inherit not just the family fortune, but its secrets. He spoke of the first time he was brought into the basement, the first time he heard the chains rattle in the darkness. He had tried to run, to rebel, but the weight of expectation, of blood and duty, had always pulled him back. It was only when he saw the youngest child, no older than his own little brother, that he found the strength to betray his family and confess. Margaret, fierce and unrepentant, refused to speak at all. She sat in her cell, eyes blazing with defiance, her silence a wall no one could breach. Some believed she was as much a victim as the others, a girl twisted by the horrors she had witnessed. Others whispered that she had been her father's willing accomplice, that she had relished the power that came from holding life and death in her hands. And then there was Thomas, the youngest, whose mind had retreated so far into itself that no one could reach him. He stared at the walls, rocking back and forth, his lips moving in silent prayer or incantation. The doctors called it madness, a mercy that spared him the full weight of memory. But the townsfolk whispered that he had seen something in the basement, something that had broken him beyond repair. As the confessions mounted, so too did the rumors. The townspeople, desperate to make sense of the senseless, turned to the supernatural for answers. Some claimed the Sullivans had made a pact with the devil, that the house itself was cursed, its foundations laid atop an ancient burial ground. Others spoke of strange lights seen in the woods, of animals found mutilated, of a coldness that lingered long after the family was gone. The old women in the market crossed themselves and muttered prayers, while the children dared each other to approach the abandoned estate after dark. The investigators, for all their rationality, could not ignore the evidence of something uncanny. The symbols carved into the basement walls matched no known language, their shapes twisting and writhing in the lantern light. The air in the chamber was colder than the rest of the house, heavy with a sense of dread that defied explanation. Some of the children spoke of dreams of shadowy figures that watched them from the corners, of voices that whispered promises and threats in the darkness. One girl, her eyes wide and unblinking, insisted that the chains had moved on their own, tightening and loosening with a will that was not human. Yet, for all the talk of curses and demons, the true horror lay in the Sullivans' humanity. Their motives, twisted as they were, sprang from the same soil as the town's own fears and desires. Charles's need for control, Eleanor's desperate longing for safety, Henry's yearning for approval, Margaret's hunger for power, Thomas's retreat into Fantasio, were reflections of the community's own secrets, magnified and distorted by isolation and privilege. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred, as did the line between sanity and madness. The Sullivans had convinced themselves that their actions were justified, that the suffering of a few could save the many. They had built a fortress of rationalizations, each brick laid with care, each lie told first to themselves and then to the world. In the end, it was not some ancient evil that had corrupted them, but the slow, insidious poison of unchecked power and unchallenged belief. But was there something even darker at work in the Sullivan house? Was the evil that took root there born of human frailty, or did it feed on something older, something that had always lurked beneath the surface of the land? The townsfolk, for all their prayers and rituals, could not say. The investigators, for all their logic and evidence, could not explain the chill that lingered in the basement, the way the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. In the weeks and months that followed the Sullivan basement's unsealing, the county staggered beneath the weight of its own horror. The children, once faceless names whispered in fear, became living reminders of the nightmare that had festered in their midst. Some were claimed by distant relatives, their reunions marked by tears and awkward embraces, as if love alone could erase the years of darkness. Others, with no family left to return to, were sent to orphanages, strangers in strange towns, their stories reduced to cautionary tales and medical reports. The youngest clung to their caretakers, waking in the night with screams that echoed through the halls. The older ones grew silent and watchful, their eyes always searching for exits, their trust slow to return. The Sullivans themselves met fates as fractured as their family. Charles, the patriarch, was tried and convicted, his name forever blackened. He died in prison, his final days spent in isolation, muttering prayers to a God who no longer answered. Eleanor, broken by grief and guilt, was committed to an asylum, her mind unraveling in the endless corridors of memory and regret. Henry, the son who confessed, was spared the gallows, but not the burden of his conscience. He left Virginia, vanishing into the anonymity of the North, his letters home growing fewer and more desperate until they stopped altogether. Margaret, ever defiant, was acquitted on grounds of insanity. She lived out her days in a convent, her silence unbroken, her eyes fixed on a horizon no one else could see. Thomas, the youngest, never spoke again. He was cared for by distant cousins, his world reduced to a single room and the slow, endless rocking of his own body. The estate itself became a wound on the land. The gardens grew wild, the windows shattered by stones thrown in anger and fear. No one wished to buy the property. No one dared to live there. The house stood empty, its walls sagging, its doors chained shut. Children dared each other to approach, but even the bravest would not cross the threshold. The basement, once a place of unspeakable suffering, became a legend, a place where the air was always cold, where the light never seemed to reach. The community, for all its public outrage, bore its own private scars. In the town square, voices rose in condemnation, demanding justice, demanding answers. The church was filled with weeping and prayers, the sermons thick with warnings against pride and complacency. Yet behind closed doors, shame festered. Mothers wondered if they had missed the signs, if their own children might have been next. Fathers drank more, their tempers short, their silences longer. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, each wondering who had known, who had chosen to look away. The officials who had failed to act resigned in disgrace or clung to their posts with desperate justifications. The sheriff, once so certain of his own authority, was haunted by the faces of the children he had failed to protect. The magistrate, his hands trembling, signed order after order, as if paperwork could erase the past. The pastor's sermons grew quieter, his eyes shadowed by doubt. The psychological wounds ran deepest. The children's laughter, once the music of the town, was now a rare and fragile thing. The adults, stripped of their illusions, found themselves questioning everything, each kindness, each act of trust, each moment of silence. The Sullivan story became a mirror, reflecting the darkness that can grow in any heart, in any home, when fear and pride are allowed to rule. Would you have spoken out or stayed silent? It is easy, from the safety of distance, to say you would have acted, that you would have seen what others missed. But the truth is rarely so simple. The people of the county were not monsters, nor were they heroes. They were ordinary, flawed, afraid. They wanted to believe in the goodness of their neighbors, in the safety of their world. They wanted to look away, to trust that someone else would do what needed to be done. And so the scars remained on the land, on the children, on the hearts of all who lived through those terrible days. The Sullivan estate became a warning, a story told in hushed voices, a lesson carved into the bones of the county. The darkness had been exposed, but it had not been vanquished. It lingered, a shadow at the edge of every light, a question that could never be fully answered. Would you have spoken out or stayed silent? The answer, perhaps, is not as clear as we would like to believe. History is not merely a record of dates and deeds, but a living shadow that stretches into the present, shaping the way we see ourselves and each other. The story of the Sullivan family is not just a tale of individual evil, but a meditation on the darkness that can take root when secrets are allowed to fester, when silence is mistaken for safety, and when the comfort of denial outweighs the courage of truth. What is evil, truly? Is it the monstrous act itself, or the slow, quiet erosion of empathy that allows such acts to go unchallenged? The Sullivans were not born villains. They were shaped by fear, by pride, by the relentless pressure to maintain appearances at any cost. Their neighbors, their servants, even the officials sworn to protect the innocent toll, became complicit, not through malice, but through the small, daily choices to look away, to trust in the familiar, to believe that such things could never happen here. Complicity is rarely dramatic. It is the nod in a meeting, the silence at a dinner table, the refusal to ask a difficult question. It is the comfort of belonging, the fear of standing alone. And yet, it is in these moments that the seeds of horror are sown. The Sullivan basement was not built in a day. It was constructed brick by brick by a community's unwillingness to see what was right before their eyes. How many horrors remain hidden in plain sight, even now? How many secrets are buried beneath the surface of our own lives, our own towns, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to uncover them? What stories do our walls whisper when we are alone, and what truths do we choose not to hear? I invite you to reflect on these questions. Have you ever witnessed something that didn't feel right, but said nothing? Have you ever wondered what lies behind the closed doors of your own community? Share your thoughts, your stories, your fears in the comments below. This is not just a story from the past, it is a mirror held up to each of us asking what we will do when faced with the shadows in our own history. Let this be a place for honest conversation, for empathy, for the courage to confront the darkness wherever it may be found. Thank you for walking with me through the shadows of the Sullivan estate, for daring to confront the darkness that history so often tries to hide. Stories like this are not just relics of a distant past, they are warnings, reminders that the line between safety and horror is thinner than we care to admit. If this journey has unsettled you, or made you question what lies beneath the surface of your own world, you are not alone. This community is built on curiosity, courage, and the willingness to ask the questions others fear. If you haven't already, subscribe and join us as we continue to unearth the stories that history tried to bury. Your thoughts, your theories, and your experiences are what make this channel a living archive of the unspoken and the unknown. Share your reactions in the comments. What would you have done if you lived in the shadow of the Sullivan house? Have you ever sensed secrets lurking, just out of sight in your own life? And as you turn off the light tonight, ask yourself, what other secrets lie buried in America's forgotten basements? What stories are waiting, patient and silent, for someone brave enough to listen? In our next episode, we'll descend even deeper into the hidden corners of history, where truth and terror walk hand in hand. Until then, keep questioning, keep searching, and remember the past is never as far away as it seems.